rain was a promise on the wind, a scent of wet dust and cool relief that did little to soothe the coiled knot in Elias Thorne's gut. He stood on his porch, watching the bruised twilight swallow the edges of his land, the vast, lonely expanse of the Wyoming Territory that was both his kingdom and his prison. The wind whipped the hem of his worn duster, a restless spirit mirroring his own. For 5 years, since Martha and little Samuel had been taken by the fever, silence had been his only companion. It was a silence he had cultivated, a wall built of routine and hard labor, and he guarded it jealously. That was why the sound, when it came, was such a violation. It wasn't the cry of a coyote or the lowing of his cattle. It was a human sound, thin and desperate, nearly shredded by the rising wind. Elias stiffened, his hand moving instinctively to the Colt peacemaker holstered at his hip. Trouble traveled fast in these parts, but it rarely came knocking. It usually arrived with the thunder of hooves or the flash of a rifle barrel. He moved from the porch, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. As he neared the sturdy wooden gate that marked the edge of his home paddock, the source of the sound came into view, a tableau of such misery it stole the breath from his lungs. There were 7 of them, 7 women huddled together like a flock of broken-winged birds against the gate, their faces pale and smudged with soot in the fading light. Their dresses were torn and travel-stained, inadequate for the coming storm. One of them, a woman with hair the color of corn silk and eyes wide with a fear so profound it looked like shock, held a small blanket-wrapped bundle to her chest. An older woman with iron-gray hair braided neatly at her nape stood with a stoic dignity, her hand resting on the shoulder of a weeping girl who couldn't be more than 16. But it was the woman who stepped forward that held his gaze. She was not the oldest nor the youngest, but she carried the unmistakable air of a leader. Her brown hair was escaping a tight bun whipped into tendrils by the wind, and her face, though etched with exhaustion, held a spark of fierce, unyielding resolve. "Sir," she began, her voice hoarse but clear, refusing to tremble, "I am Sarah. We are in need of shelter." Elias's eyes narrowed against the wind and suspicion swept over them again. 7 women, one a mother with a babe in arms, all of them on foot miles from any town, with a storm about to break. It was a recipe for death. He didn't speak. His silence was a shield, a thing he used to keep the world at bay. He let it stretch, heavy and uncomfortable, watching them. He saw the desperation in the way their shoulders slumped, the hope in the way they watched his face. "Please," Sarah said, her voice cracking just a little. "Our wagon, there was a fire. We lost everything. We've been walking for 2 days. The storm—" She didn't need to finish. The first fat drop of rain struck Elias's cheek, as cold as a premonition. His first instinct, the one honed by years of solitude and loss, was to say no. They were not his problem. His heart was a fallow field, and he had no charity left to grow. Let them move on. But then the baby in the young mother's arms let out a thin, mewling cry, a sound that lanced through the wall around his heart and struck a nerve he thought long dead. It was the sound of utter helplessness, the sound his own Samuel had made. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He looked from the crying infant to Sarah's resolute face, then to the vast, unforgiving emptiness at their backs. To turn them away now was to sentence them. He was a hard man, but he was not a murderer. With a deep, guttural sigh that seemed to be pulled from the very soles of his boots, Elias Thorne reached for the latch on the gate. The groan of the wood as he pulled it open was the sound of his carefully constructed world beginning to crack. "The barn," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "You can stay in the barn, get out of the rain." The barn was a cavern of shadows and warm, earthy smells, hay, leather, and livestock. A single lantern that Elias lit cast long, dancing shadows, turning the familiar space into something alien and alive. The women filed in, their movements stiff with exhaustion and cold. The weeping girl stumbled, and the older woman, Elspeth, caught her with a steadying arm and a quiet murmur. Elias stood by the door, the lantern held high, feeling like an intruder in his own domain. He watched them choose a spot in the far corner, a small section of clean, dry hay where they collapsed more than sat. The young mother, Mary, immediately began to fuss over her baby, her movements frantic with worry as she checked the swaddling for dampness. Sarah, however, remained on her feet, her gaze sweeping over the barn, the sturdy timbers, the well-mended tack, the healthy sheen on the coats of his 2 horses in their stalls. Her eyes were assessing, gauging the measure of the man who had granted them this grudging mercy. "Admit that we have many sisters," she prompted, her voice still hoarse. "Thorne," he supplied, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. He hadn't had to introduce himself to anyone in years. Elias Thorne. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." Her gratitude was simple, direct. There was no fawning, no theatrical display. It was the gratitude of one survivor to another. Elias gave a curt nod, uncomfortable under her direct gaze. "There's a pump outside the door. Water's clean. The hay is dry. It's better than the storm." As if on cue, the wind howled and the rain began to hammer against the barn's roof, a deafening tattoo that underscored his words. The women flinched, huddling closer together, a silent testament to what they had just escaped. He should leave them. He had done his part. He had offered shelter. Now he could retreat to the stone and timber silence of his house, bolt the door, and pretend they weren't there. But he couldn't move. He watched as Mary rocked her baby, her lips moving in a silent prayer or a lullaby. He saw the way the youngest girl, whose name he didn't know, stared into the lantern flame as if it were the last fire in the world. He saw the weariness in Elspeth's bones, a weariness that went deeper than the miles they had walked. They were soot-stained and bedraggled, yet they clung to each other with a fierce, quiet loyalty. They were a family of circumstance, bound by a shared disaster. It was a dynamic he recognized, a fortress built against the cruelty of the world. His own fortress was one of silence. Theirs was one of communion. "Are you hungry?" The question left his mouth before he could stop it. It was a fool question. Of course they were hungry. Their faces were hollowed out by it. Sarah's eyes met his, and for the first time a flicker of something other than desperation crossed her face. It was surprise. "We wouldn't impose any further, Mr. Thorne. You've been more than generous." "Didn't ask if you'd impose," he grumbled, his tone harsher than he intended. "Asked if you were hungry." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her pride warring with the gnawing emptiness he could see in her eyes. Pride lost. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We are." Elias gave another sharp nod, as if settling a business transaction. "Stay put." He turned and strode out of the barn, pulling the heavy door almost closed behind him to keep out the driving rain. As he walked the short distance to his house, the rain soaking his shoulders, he felt a profound sense of unease. For 5 years, he had cooked for one, planned for one, existed for one. The thought of 7 more mouths to feed, even for a single night, was a logistical and emotional disruption of the highest order. He entered the cold, clean kitchen of his house. It was a place of stark utility. A cast-iron stove, a scrubbed pine table with a single chair, a shelf with a single plate, a single cup. It was the kitchen of a man who ate to live, nothing more. Looking at it now through the lens of the 7 desperate souls in his barn, it looked less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. The silence he had so carefully guarded suddenly seemed empty. Inside the barn, the initial wave of relief gave way to the sharp reality of their situation. The hammering rain on the roof was a constant reminder of how close they had come to perishing in the storm. Mary had unwrapped her son, Samuel, and was examining his small, pale form by the lantern light. He was thankfully dry, but his fretful cries spoke of hunger and cold. He needs milk," Mary whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I have nothing left to give." Elsbeth, the older woman, moved to her side. Her touch was gentle, her presence a calming balm. "Hush now, child, we are safe and out of the elements. That is a miracle in itself. Let us hold on to that." "A miracle?" scoffed a sharp-featured woman named Agnes, who was wringing the water from the hem of her skirt. "We're sleeping in a barn, our belongings are a pile of ash, and we're at the mercy of a man who looks at us like we're vermin. Some miracle?" "Agnes, please," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "The man gave us shelter when he could have turned us away. That's enough for now." "Has a house," Agnes countered, gesturing vaguely toward the dark shape of the main building. "A proper house with beds and a fire." "And we are strangers," Elspeth said softly, her gaze steady on Agnes. "He owes us nothing. Let us be grateful for what we have been given." The youngest girl, Clara, who had been weeping, looked up at Sarah. "What will we do? Where will we go?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. They were supposed to be in Oregon by now, part of a small, hopeful settlement founded by their husbands and fathers. They were the second wave, the women and children, traveling with supplies to build a community. But a single stray spark from their campfire, a sudden gust of wind, had turned their prairie schooner into an inferno. They had escaped with their lives and the clothes on their backs, nothing more. "I don't know yet," Sarah answered honestly, meeting Clara's gaze. "First, we get through the night. We rest. In the morning, with the storm past, we will think about the next step." She spoke with a confidence she didn't feel. Looking at the faces around her, Mary's maternal fear, Agnes's bitter anger, Clara's youthful terror, and the quiet despair on the faces of the other three, the sisters Eleanor and Beatrice, and the silent widow Catherine, she felt the crushing weight of leadership. She had been the one to urge them on, to insist they could make it to the next town. She had been the one to approach the gate of the lonely ranch. Their survival rested on her shoulders. She walked to the large barn door and peered through the crack. The rain fell in solid, impenetrable sheets. The light in the house was on, a single yellow square in the maelstrom. She wondered about the man, Elias Thorne. His face was a mask of grief and hardness, his eyes holding a sorrow so deep it looked like a permanent part of him. He lived in this vast emptiness all alone, and the silence of his house seemed to cling to him like a shroud. He was a man who had walled himself off from the world, and they had just breached his defenses. She wasn't sure if that made him a savior or a jailer. A moment later, the barn door creaked open and Thorne stood there, silhouetted against the storm. He held no weapon, only a large, steaming pot in one hand and a stack of tin plates and spoons in the other. Behind him, he had managed to balance a pile of heavy wool blankets under his arm. He said nothing, simply strode to the center of their small circle and set the items down on a clean patch of hay. The smell that rose from the pot was simple and overwhelming, a thick stew of beef and root vegetables. It was the smell of life itself. The women stared at the pot, their hunger a palpable thing in the lantern light. Elias Thorne looked at Mary and the fussing baby. "There's milk," he said, his voice a low rumble. "From the house. It's fresh for the boy." He had placed a small corked bottle beside the blankets. Mary's head snapped up, her eyes wide and luminous with unshed tears. Thank you," she stammered, reaching for the bottle as if it were a holy relic. Elias simply grunted in response, his gaze sweeping over them once more before he turned and walked back toward the door. He paused there, his back to them. "There's enough for everyone," he said, without looking back. And then he was gone, pulling the door shut, leaving them alone with the scent of hot food and the unexpected, astonishing gift of his kindness. The stew was hot and rich, and the women ate in a near-reverent silence, the clinking of spoons against tin plates the only sound besides the storm and the baby's contented gurgles as he drank the milk. Each spoonful was a small victory against the cold, the fear, and the gnawing hunger that had been their companion for 2 days. The simple act of eating a hot meal felt like a profound luxury, a turning point. When they were finished, their bellies full for the first time since the fire, a sense of weary calm settled over the group. The blankets Elias had brought were coarse but thick and warm. They wrapped themselves and each other, the shared warmth a comfort as potent as the food. Sarah collected the plates, intending to find a way to wash them at the pump in the morning. She felt a deep, pressing need to show their host that they were not savages, that his charity would be respected. As she stacked them, her eyes fell upon Elias's house. The single light was still burning in the window. She couldn't shake the image of his face, the deep-set loneliness in his eyes. A man who kept fresh milk, who could conjure a stew for 7 on a moment's notice, was not a man entirely given over to ruin. He was prepared. He was self-sufficient. But the emptiness of his home spoke of a different kind of poverty. An hour passed. The storm raged on, but inside the barn, a fragile peace had taken hold. Most of the women were dozing, succumbing to the exhaustion that food and warmth had finally allowed to claim them. Only Sarah and Elspeth remained awake, watching over the others. The barn door opened again. This time Elias did not hesitate at the threshold. He walked directly to them, his expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light. "The storm's worsening," he stated, not as a conversation starter, but as a fact. "The roof on this barn is sound, but the wind will find every crack. It's no place for a baby." Sarah got to her feet, her body tense. "We will manage, Mr. Thorne. You have already done more than enough." He ignored her, his gaze fixed on the sleeping form of Mary and her child. The sight seemed to hold him, and a shadow of some old, deep pain moved across his features before he blinked it away. "The house has 2 spare rooms upstairs," he said, the words sounding as if they were being pulled from him against his will. "The beds haven't been slept in for 5 years, but they're dry. The stove in the parlor will keep the whole floor warm." Sarah stared at him, stunned into silence. She had expected him to check on his livestock, perhaps, or to issue a warning. She had not expected this. An offer of the barn was charity. An offer of his home was something else entirely. It was an invitation, a breach in the very walls he had built around himself. "Mr. Thorne, we couldn't possibly," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp, impatient gesture. "I'm not offering for your comfort," he said, his voice gruff, as if embarrassed by his own impulse. "I'm offering for the boys. I won't have a death on my land. Not again." The last 2 words were spoken so softly they were nearly lost to the wind, but Sarah heard them. They were the key, the explanation for the haunted look in his eyes, for the single chair at his table, for the crushing loneliness that permeated his entire being. "Not again." She looked at Elspeth, who gave a slow, deliberate nod. This was not a moment for pride. This was a moment for acceptance. "All right," Sarah said, her voice quiet. "Thank you, Elias." Using his first name was a risk, an assumption of intimacy that wasn't there, but she felt a sudden need to see him as more than just Mr. Thorne the rancher. He was a man with a ghost, and in that moment, she understood him a little better. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, at the sound of his name spoken aloud in his own barn. For a long moment, he just stood there, the rain and wind roaring outside, the 7 women, a silent, watching jury, inside. He had opened the gate, and now he was opening his door. He was letting the world in, and he looked terrified. "Get your things," he said, his voice a low rasp. "What's left of them? I'll take the mother and child first." He turned and walked back to the house, leaving the door open this time, a path of light cutting through the darkness, waiting for them to follow. The house was as spare and silent as Sarah had imagined, but it was also immaculately clean. The air inside smelled of pine soap and old wood, a scent far removed from the dust and desperation of their journey. A fire was already blazing in the stone hearth of the main parlor, its light dancing on the simple, sturdy furniture and polished wooden floors. It was a space that radiated a sense of profound, abiding solitude. Elias led them up a narrow staircase to the 2nd floor. True to his word, there were 2 rooms, each containing 2 simple beds with patched but clean quilts folded at their feet. The rooms were cold and smelled of disuse, the air still and heavy like a held breath. It took 2 trips to bring everyone and their meager blankets from the barn. Elias moved with a grim efficiency, his face set in a stony mask. He deposited them in the rooms and then retreated downstairs as if fleeing a fire. They could hear him moving about below, the heavy tread of his boots on the floorboards, the clank of the stove as he added more wood. The women stood clustered in the doorways of the rooms, looking at the beds with a kind of awe. A real bed, with a mattress stuffed with straw and a pillow, felt like an unimaginable luxury. I don't know what to say," Mary whispered, gently laying her sleeping baby on one of the quilts. The child, warm and fed, didn't stir. "Say nothing," Elspeth advised, her practical nature taking over. "Show our gratitude with our actions. We will be ghosts in this man's house. We will make no trouble. We will leave this place better than we found it." Agnes, for once, was silent, her usual cynicism tempered by the crackling fire downstairs and the soft bed before her. Sarah felt a shift in the air, a change in her own responsibilities. In the wild, she was their leader, their protector. Here, in this man's home, she was their ambassador. It was up to her to navigate the fragile truce between their desperate party and their reluctant host. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and glittering in the pale morning sun. Sarah was the first to wake. She crept downstairs, her bare feet silent on the cold wood. The house was still, but the fire in the parlor had been banked and was still glowing with embers. Elias was already gone, the front door left slightly ajar. Through it she could see him in the distance, checking his fences, his solitary figure stark against the wide-open sky. The kitchen was as she remembered it, but on the table, where the single plate and cup had been, Elias had left a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, and a slab of bacon. There was no note. It was a silent, practical provision, a promise, not of permanence, but of sustenance for the day ahead. A wave of determination washed over Sarah. Elsbeth was right. They would show their gratitude. By the time the other women stirred and came downstairs, Sarah had the fire in the kitchen stove roaring and a pot of coffee brewing. Its rich aroma was the first thing to greet them, a scent of civilization and normalcy that they hadn't experienced in weeks. Soon, the house was filled with a quiet, purposeful industry it hadn't known in years. Elspeth, it turned out, could make biscuits from memory with a light, practiced hand. Eleanor and Beatrice, the quiet sisters, found the pump and a wash basin and began a gentle, thorough cleaning of the parlor. Mary tended to her baby, her face relaxed for the first time. Even Agnes found a task, sharpening the dull kitchen knives with a whetstone she'd discovered in a drawer. When Elias returned at midday, weary from his work, he stopped dead in the doorway. The silence of his home was gone. In its place was the murmur of female voices, the smell of baking biscuits and brewing coffee, the scent of soap and hot water. The dust motes that had danced in the sunbeams were gone, the surfaces of his tables wiped clean. He looked around, his face a thundercloud of confusion and intrusion. 7 women had not just taken shelter in his house, they had taken root. They were bringing it back to life, and Elias Thorne looked as if he were seeing a ghost. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Elias would rise before dawn, his movements quiet and deliberate, and leave for his work on the ranch. He would leave provisions on the kitchen table, potatoes, flour, a cut of venison, and then vanish into the vastness of his land. He was providing for them, but from a distance, like a man leaving food out for a pack of stray cats he didn't want to get too close to. The women, in turn, ran the house. They cooked, cleaned, mended, and washed. They turned the stark, silent house into a home, the air filled with the smells of baking bread and simmering soup. The low murmur of conversation replaced the heavy silence. Mary's baby, Samuel, grew stronger, his happy gurgles a constant, cheerful punctuation to the day. For Elias, the change was a daily assault on his senses. He would return at dusk, tired to the bone, and be met not with the cold silence he was accustomed to, but with warmth, light, and life. He would find a hot meal waiting for him on the stove, his single plate set at the head of the kitchen table. The women would fall quiet when he entered, retreating to the parlor to give him his space. He ate alone, the sounds of their soft chatter from the next room an ever-present reminder of their invasion. He was a man caught between 2 warring impulses. Part of him, the part that had grieved alone for 5 years, resented the intrusion. He missed the absolute predictability of his solitude. He found himself tensing as he approached the house, bracing for the sounds and smells that were not his own. The laughter of the younger girls, Clara and Eleanor, felt like a physical blow sometimes, a reminder of a life he no longer had. But another part of him, a part he refused to acknowledge, was slowly, grudgingly thawing. He had not eaten a hot meal he hadn't cooked himself in 5 years. He had not smelled baking bread in his own kitchen since Martha was alive. He found himself listening to their conversations from the other room, learning their names, their histories, their fear. He learned that Elspeth's husband had died on the trail west, that the sisters Beatrice and Eleanor were hoping to become teachers, that Agnes's sharp tongue was a shield for a deep-seated fear of being helpless. One evening he came in from the barn after a long day of mending a collapsed section of fence. He was soaked with sweat and covered in dust. As he stepped into the kitchen, he found Sarah there, alone, mending one of his work shirts by the light of a lamp. The needle moved with a swift, sure grace in her hands. A neat pile of his repaired clothing sat on the table beside her. She looked up as he entered, her fingers stilling. "Mr. Thorne," she said quietly, "your dinner is on the stove." He just stood there, looking at the shirt in her hands. It was the one with the tear near the collar that he'd been meaning to fix for a month. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. Sarah met his gaze, her own steady and clear. "We are not parasites, Mr. Thorne. We earn our keep. You have given us shelter and food. In return, we give our labor. It is the only currency we possess." Her words were simple, direct, and stripped of all sentimentality. It was a pact, an agreement, and it was this practicality, this refusal to treat him as either a saint or a monster, that disarmed him more than anything else. He gave a curt nod, unable to form a reply. He took his plate of food and retreated to his usual spot at the head of the table. He ate in silence, but for the first time, the silence felt different. It was not the oppressive silence of loneliness, but a quiet space filled with the soft, rhythmic scratch of a needle pulling thread, a sound that was, in its own way, a kind of company. He was still a lonely rancher, but for the first time in 5 years, he was not entirely alone. A week turned into 2, and the initial supply of flour and coffee began to dwindle. The garden Elias kept provided vegetables, and his hunting provided meat, but staples required a trip to town. The town, Harmony Creek, was a full day's ride to the east, and it was a place Elias avoided with a grim determination. It was a place of memories, of sympathetic looks that felt like pity, of questions he had no desire to answer. He announced his intention one morning, his words clipped. "I'm riding to town for supplies. I'll be gone 2 days." A sudden silence fell over the kitchen. The women exchanged worried glances. Their existence here was a secret, a fragile bubble that could be burst by a single careless word in the wrong ear. Sarah stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron. "Let me come with you," she said. It wasn't a question. Elias scowled. "It's a long ride, and the town's no place for—" He stopped, unsure how to finish. "A woman without a husband or a clear purpose." "I can ride," Sarah said simply. "And you'll need help carrying what you buy. More importantly," she added, her voice dropping slightly, "you'll be buying for 8 people. That will raise questions. It's better if I'm there. We can say I am your widowed sister, come to keep house for you." He hated that she was right. A bachelor buying 7 sacks of flour would set tongues wagging for a month. Her logic was sound, a clean, sharp line through the messy problem of public opinion. He warred with himself for a long moment, the desire for solitude clashing with the undeniable sense of her competence. "Fine," he grunted, "be ready at sunrise." The ride to Harmony Creek was mostly silent. They rode side by side, Elias on his sturdy gelding and Sarah on the gentler of his 2 mares, a horse that hadn't been ridden by anyone but him in years. Sarah, true to her word, handled the horse with an easy confidence that surprised him. She didn't chatter. She seemed content to watch the rolling plains, her expression thoughtful. The silence was different from the one he usually traveled in. It wasn't empty. It was a shared quiet, a comfortable space between 2 people who understood the value of not speaking. He found himself noticing small things. The way the sun caught the red highlights in her brown hair, the determined set of her jaw. They arrived in Harmony Creek as the sun was high in the sky. The town was a single dusty street lined with wooden storefronts, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a general store. As they dismounted in front of the store, Elias felt the old familiar tension grip him. He saw Mrs. Gable, the town's foremost gossip, pause her sweeping on the boardwalk to stare at them, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Just stick to the story," Elias muttered to Sarah as they entered the store. The store's owner, a balding man named Henderson, greeted Elias with a familiar nod. "Thorne, been a while. Good to see you come down from that mountain of yours." His eyes immediately slid to Sarah, his gaze lingering. "Henderson," Elias said, his voice flat. "This is my sister Sarah. She's come to stay with me." "Your sister?" Henderson said, his eyebrows shooting up. "Didn't know you had a sister." "A widow," Sarah said, her voice soft and tinged with a believable sadness. "My husband passed. Elias was kind enough to take me in." The explanation was perfect. It was tragic enough to garner sympathy and simple enough to be believed. Henderson's expression softened immediately. "Well, I'm very sorry for your loss, ma'am. Welcome to Harmony Creek." They began to gather their supplies, and the sheer volume was staggering. Sacks of flour, sugar, coffee, beans, salt. Henderson's eyes grew wider with each item Elias added to the pile. "Expecting a long winter, Thorne?" the shopkeeper asked, a jovial tone in his voice. "Something like that," Elias replied noncommittally. As they were paying, the door swung open and Sheriff Brody walked in. He was a big man with a florid face and a self-important air. His gaze swept the room, landing on Elias and Sarah and the mountain of supplies on the counter. "Thorne," he said, his voice holding a note of authority, "that's a hell of a lot of food for 2 people." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Sheriff Brody was a man who enjoyed the weight of his badge, a man who saw suspicion in every shadow. "My sister is a good cook," Elias said, his voice level. "She likes to be prepared." Brody's eyes moved from Elias to Sarah, a slow, appraising look that made Elias's hand twitch toward his hip. "Your sister, you say? Funny, I've been sheriff here for 10 years. Knew your wife, Martha, God rest her soul. She never mentioned you had a sister." "We were not close in recent years," Sarah interjected smoothly, her voice calm and steady, betraying none of the tension that crackled in the air. "Family troubles. I'm sure you understand, Sheriff." She gave him a small, sad smile that was a masterpiece of misdirection. The sheriff grunted, not entirely convinced. "And you just decided to come all the way out to this desolate place to live with him?" "My brother needed me," she said simply, "and I had nowhere else to go." The last words were spoken with such genuine, quiet pain that even Brody seemed momentarily taken aback. She was using the truth of her situation to sell the lie. Elias watched her, a grudging admiration growing within him. She was strong, not with the brittle strength of a man, but with the flexible, resilient strength of woven steel. She did not back down, but she did not provoke. "Well," Brody said, clearing his throat, his bluster slightly deflated, "see that you stay out of trouble, Thorne." He tipped his hat curtly to Sarah and walked out of the store, but not before giving the pile of supplies one last, long, speculative look. The moment the door closed, Mr. Henderson leaned forward. "Don't you mind him," he whispered. "Sheriff Brody's just suspicious of anything that changes. A new face in town is a major event for him." They finished their transaction and began the arduous task of loading the supplies onto a pack mule Elias had tethered outside. As they worked, Elias was acutely aware of the eyes on them. Mrs. Gable was now whispering animatedly to the blacksmith's wife across the street. The story of Elias Thorne's mysterious widowed sister would be all over town by nightfall. "That was close," Elias said, his voice a low growl as he cinched a rope over a sack of flour. "He believed it," Sarah said, lifting a heavy crate of tinned goods with a grunt of effort. "For now. You're a good liar." She stopped and looked at him, her expression serious. "I told him I had nowhere else to go. That was the truest thing I've ever said." His gaze locked with hers, and in that moment he saw past the lie to the desperate reality it was built upon. He saw the fire, the flight, the terror. He saw the weight she carried for the other 6 women. A new feeling rose in him, something fierce and protective. It wasn't just about charity anymore or about preventing a death on his land. These women, this stranger beside him, were under his roof. Brody's suspicion had made them a we, and the town's prying eyes were an external threat that solidified their fragile alliance. He had brought her here, and he would not let this pig-headed sheriff or a bunch of gossiping townfolk bring them harm. "Let's go," he said, his tone clipped but different. The gruffness was still there, but it was now a shield meant to protect not just himself, but her as well. "I want to be clear of this town before dark." As they rode out of Harmony Creek, leaving the whispers and stares behind them, Elias felt a subtle but profound shift. He had ridden into town a lonely man. He was riding out a guardian. The silence on the ride back was deeper, more thoughtful. He was no longer just a rancher providing shelter. He was a man with a secret to keep and 7 lives to defend. They returned to the ranch under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed to frost the dark plains. A single lamp shone in the house window, a beacon in the immense darkness. As they dismounted, weary and sore, the front door opened and Elspeth stood there, her face etched with relief. "We were worried," she said simply. The other women crowded behind her, their anxious faces breaking into smiles at the sight of Sarah safe and sound. They swarmed around them, helping to unload the mule, their chatter a welcome, lively sound after the tense silence of the town. They were a family, welcoming their own back to the fold. Elias stood back, watching the scene, feeling like an outsider, yet inextricably part of it. He had provided the means for this reunion, for this moment of relief. Later that night, after the supplies were stored and the house had settled into a quiet hum, Elias found himself on the front porch. He couldn't sleep. The encounter with Sheriff Brody had unsettled him, stirring a protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. He leaned against a porch post, staring out at the land that was his, the vast, silent darkness that had been his only confidant. The door creaked open behind him. It was Sarah. She came to stand beside him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the night's chill. For a long time they stood in silence, listening to the chirping of crickets and the sigh of the wind through the prairie grass. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice soft. "For today. For standing up for me. For us." "Brody's a fool," Elias grunted, "likes the sound of his own voice." "He's a threat," she corrected gently. "He won't let this go. He'll find a reason to come out here." Elias knew she was right. "Let him come," he said, a hard edge to his voice. "This is my land. He has no authority here without a damn good reason." Another silence settled between them, more comfortable this time. "Will they stay here?" Sarah asked quietly. "All alone? It's a hard life for one person." Elias's jaw tightened. It was a question no one had dared ask him for 5 years. He looked out at the darkness, at the spot on the low hill, unmarked but burned forever into his memory, where he had buried his wife and son. "I had a family once," he said, the words tasting like rust. "A wife, Martha. A son, Samuel. He was 4 years old." He paused, the silence stretching as he wrestled with the ghosts of his past. "There was a fever. It swept through Harmony Creek. I thought being out here, isolated, we'd be safe. But I was wrong. It took 'em both in a week." He finally turned to look at her, letting her see the raw grief he had kept hidden for so long. "I built this house for them, for a future. When they were gone, the silence was all I had left of them. Being alone felt like honoring their memory. Filling the house with noise felt like a betrayal." Sarah's eyes were luminous with a deep, sorrowful understanding. She didn't offer empty platitudes or pity. She simply listened. "The baby," Elias continued, his voice thick, "Mary's boy. He's named Samuel, too. Did you know that?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes. When I first saw you at the gate," he confessed, "all I wanted was for you to go away. But then I heard him cry, and I couldn't." This was the truth of it, the core of his decision. A single cry in the dark had echoed another, and he had been undone. Sarah reached out, her hand resting for a fleeting moment on his forearm. Her touch was light, but it sent a jolt of warmth through him that had nothing to do with the night's temperature. "You're not betraying them, Elias," she said softly. "You're honoring them. You saved 7 lives. You saved a little boy named Samuel. I think Martha would be proud of that." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had seen their presence as a desecration of his shrine of grief, but she had just reframed it as its ultimate validation. He looked from her earnest, compassionate face to the house behind them, no longer a tomb, but a place filled with the sounds of life, of survival. The promise he had made, the grudging offer of shelter, had become something more. It had become a promise to himself, a reason to fight the ghosts and face the dawn. And for the first time, he felt the crushing weight of his loneliness begin to lift, replaced by the terrifying, hopeful burden of a future he never thought he'd have. The first snow came early that year, not as a gentle dusting, but as a sudden violent blizzard that swept down from the mountains without warning. It descended upon the ranch like a white fury, erasing the world in a swirling vortex of wind and ice. Within hours, the house was an island in a sea of white. The fences, the barn, and the horizon, all swallowed by the storm. They were trapped. The atmosphere inside the house shifted instantly. The quiet, industrious rhythm was replaced by a taut, anxious watchfulness. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes and finding its way through invisible cracks in the walls, sending icy drafts skittering across the floor. Elias was a coiled spring of grim energy. He worked constantly, checking the seals on the windows, ensuring the firewood was stacked high by the hearth, rationing the grain for the livestock he'd managed to secure in the barn just before the worst of it hit. This was a familiar enemy. He had fought the Wyoming winter alone for 5 years. But this time the stakes were impossibly higher. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was responsible for 8 other souls. The women, led by Sarah and Elspeth, were no less determined. They conserved food with a ruthless efficiency, making thin, watery soups last and ensuring every scrap was used. They spent their days knitting, mending, and telling stories to keep their spirits up, a small circle of warmth against the raging cold. But the storm was relentless. A week passed, then 10 days. The world outside remained a maelstrom of white. And then the one thing Elias had been dreading happened. Mary's baby, Samuel, fell ill. It started with a cough, a dry, rasping sound that cut through the quiet of the house. Then came the fever. His small body burned with a terrifying heat, and his cries became weak and breathless. Mary was frantic, her face a mask of primal terror. She refused to leave his side, rocking him endlessly, her tears falling on his hot forehead. Elspeth, with her knowledge of old remedies, tried everything she could. She made poultices of mustard and onion to place on his chest and brewed teas from the dried herbs she'd insisted on gathering in the fall. But nothing worked. The baby's breathing grew more shallow, each gasp a tiny, painful struggle. "His lung fever," Elspeth said to Elias and Sarah, her voice grim, her face pale. They stood in the kitchen, out of Mary's earshot. "His lungs are filling. Without proper medicine, I don't think he'll last another 2 days." The words hung in the cold air, a death sentence. "The town," Sarah said, her eyes locking on Elias's. "The doctor." "It's a day's ride in good weather," Elias said, his voice flat and hard. "In this, it's suicide. You can't see 10 feet in front of your face. The snow has drifted higher than a man's head in places. You'd get lost in an hour." "We can't just let him die." Mary's voice, sharp with anguish, came from the parlor. She had heard them. She appeared in the doorway, her eyes wild with a desperate plea. "Please, Mr. Thorne, you have to do something, please." Elias looked at the desperate mother, then at the storm raging outside his window. He saw the impassable wall of white, and beyond it, he saw the small, unmarked grave on the hill. Not again. The words echoed in his soul, no longer a memory but a command. He had refused to let a child die on his land once before, at the gate. He would not fail now. He turned, his decision made in an instant. He strode to the hook by the door and took down his heaviest oilskin duster and fur-lined hat. "Elias, no," Sarah said, grabbing his arm. "It's impossible. You'll die out there." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then into her terrified eyes. "Maybe," he said, his voice a low, resolute growl. "But that boy dies for sure if I stay. Get my horse ready, the strong one, and pack me whatever food you can spare." He was no longer the lonely rancher. He was no longer the reluctant host. He was a man with a purpose, marching into the heart of a frozen hell to keep a promise he had made to a ghost. The world outside the front door was not a landscape. It was a formless, roaring chaos. The wind tore at Elias, stealing his breath and driving needle-sharp ice into his exposed skin. He had wrapped a wool scarf around the lower half of his face, but already he could feel the cold burning his cheeks. His gelding, a powerful, intelligent beast named Odin, fought against the wind, tossing his head and snorting clouds of steam into the whiteout. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face a pale oval of fear. She pressed a small cloth-wrapped package of dried venison and hard biscuits into his hands. "Godspeed, Elias," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the gale. He gave a single sharp nod and swung himself into the saddle. For a moment he was just a dark shape against the swirling snow, and then he spurred Odin forward, and the blizzard swallowed him whole. The hours that followed were a testament to pure animal instinct and grim determination. Elias could not see the trail. He could not see the sun. He navigated by the feel of the land beneath Odin's hooves, by the slight incline or decline of the terrain, and by an internal compass honed by years of living in this unforgiving place. The wind was a physical force, constantly trying to push him off course, to disorient him, to lull him into the fatal sleep of the cold. He thought of the small, struggling life back at the ranch. He thought of Mary's terrified face, and he thought of Sarah standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with a terror that was not for herself but for him. The thought of them, a circle of fragile life huddled around his hearth, was the fire that burned in his own chest, fighting back the encroaching ice. Back at the house, the women waited. The waiting was its own form of torture. Every howl of the wind sounded like a death cry. They kept the fire roaring, a silent vigil for the man who had ridden out into the storm for them. Sarah took charge, her own fear locked down tight beneath a veneer of calm capability. "Mary, you must rest," she insisted, gently prying the feverish baby from his mother's arms. "We will watch him. You need to keep your strength up." Elspeth continued her tireless work, bathing Samuel's head with cool water, forcing tiny spoonfuls of broth between his lips. The other women prayed, their voices a low, hopeful murmur that filled the tense silence between gusts of wind. The house had become a sanctuary, a a fortress of hope against a world of despair. And every woman in it had a role to play. They were no longer 7 disparate souls. They were a single unit, bound together by a shared fear and a common purpose, to keep the flame of a small life and their own hope from being extinguished. Sarah found herself by the window, peering into the merciless white. She was terrified for Elias. He had been a stranger to her only weeks ago, a hard, solitary man. Now, the thought of him lost and freezing in the storm was an unbearable agony. She realized with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity that his safety had become as important to her as her own. In the crucible of the blizzard, her gratitude had been forged into something deeper, something that felt terrifyingly like love. She pressed her hand to the cold glass, sending a silent prayer into the storm. "Come back," she pleaded to the howling wind. "Please, just come back." Elias made it to Harmony Creek. It was not a ride, but a battle, a brutal inch-by-inch fight against the elements that left both him and Odin encrusted in ice and trembling with exhaustion. He stumbled into the doctor's office, a wild-eyed apparition from the storm, his beard and eyebrows frozen white. The doctor, a kind, elderly man named Miller, took one look at him and rushed him to the fire. Elias, his teeth chattering, could only manage 2 words. "Lung fever. Baby?" Understanding dawned in Dr. Miller's eyes. He quickly prepared a small, precious bottle of laudanum to ease the child's breathing and a packet of powdered quinine for the fever. He gave Elias strict instructions, his words urgent. "This storm is a killer, son," he warned. "You were a fool to come." "I'd be a bigger fool if I didn't," Elias rasped, his mind already on the journey back. The return trip was a waking nightmare. The blizzard had not abated, and Elias was running on the last dregs of his strength. He fell from his horse twice, his limbs numb and clumsy with cold. Each time he forced himself back into the saddle, clutching the precious medicine to his chest. His singular focus on the light he prayed was still burning in his window. He saw the light before he saw the house, a faint golden glimmer through the swirling snow. It was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. He urged Odin into a final stumbling push, and they collapsed at the barn door, more than arrived. Sarah must have been watching, for the house door flew open the moment he came into view. She ran to him, heedless of the biting wind, her face a mixture of terror and overwhelming relief. "Elias," could barely stand. He pushed the small, wrapped package of medicine into her hands. "For the boy," he managed to say before his legs gave out. They got him inside, half carrying, half dragging him. The women surrounded him, pulling off his frozen duster, wrapping him in warm blankets and forcing hot coffee between his trembling lips. But his eyes were on Sarah as she rushed to the parlor with the medicine. Under Elspeth's careful administration, the medicine began its work. The laudanum eased the baby's tortured breathing, and the quinine began to fight the fever. By morning, as the blizzard finally blew itself out, leaving a world of pristine, silent white, Samuel's fever had broken. He was sleeping peacefully, his breathing deep and even for the first time in days. He would live. The relief in the house was a palpable thing, a collective, shuddering sigh of thanks. Mary wept, but this time her tears were of gratitude, clinging to Sarah's hand. In the weeks that followed, as a slow spring began to melt the snow, life on the ranch returned, but it was irrevocably changed. The lines between host and guests had blurred and vanished. They had faced death together and survived. They were a family. One warm afternoon, as the first green shoots pushed through the damp earth, Sarah found Elias on the porch, watching the land come back to life. He was still quiet, but the haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, steady calm. "The roads will be clear soon," she said softly, though the words felt like a betrayal. "We should start making plans. We've imposed on you for far too long." Elias turned to look at her. He reached out and took her hand, his callous palm warm and strong around hers. "This house was empty for 5 years, Sarah," he said, his voice quiet but full of a newfound certainty. "It was a tomb. You, all of you filled it with life again. To have you leave now," he shook his head, "the silence would be unbearable." He looked past her, at the women in the yard, laughing as they hung laundry in the spring sunshine. He looked at Mary, holding her healthy, gurgling son. "Don't go," he said, his eyes returning to hers, full of a sentiment he wasn't yet practiced enough to name. "Stay. This is your home now, if you'll have it." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, blurring the image of his strong, earnest face. This lonely, broken man had saved them, and in doing so they had saved him. Here in the vast, unforgiving West, at the gate of a lonely ranch, 7 women had begged for shelter and had found a home. Sarah, speaking not just for herself, but for her entire found family, gave him her answer. "We're already home, Elias," she said, and she leaned in and sealed their shared future with a promise that needed no words at all.